All right, welcome back. This is lesson number 4 for our Adobe Premiere Pro course. In this lesson, we are covering titles, graphics, and exporting in Premiere. That might be just a little bit different than titles and graphics, but this one is, I believe, slightly shorter than our others, so we can kind of squeeze that in there. There's a few different ways that we can approach creating titles in Premiere. One of the ways, if you're familiar with older versions of Premiere and you're used to the old title window, you still have access to that by clicking on File, New, Legacy Title. So it still does exist. You can create a brand new title that matches your sequence settings. There we go. And we can name it whatever we want, maybe credits. It will load up, and then you have that same layout that you might be familiar with if you've ever used this thing before. It is probably not the way to go about approaching your credits now, since we have the Essential Graphics tab, which is kind of taken over the legacy titler. But all of this stuff, if you're familiar with it, still does exist. You can build out your title using the title tool, or the type tool here. You can do vertical text if you'd like. You can type along paths. You can draw shapes. Very similar things to like a very rudimentary version of Photoshop. There are a ton of things in here though that aren't available, or there's a ton of things in Premiere that aren't available through the legacy titler. So there's some really interesting things that you can do in here, but it might be better to work not in a separated window where you can't actively work on your videos, but something a little bit more integrated, and that is instead the Essential Graphics tab. So if we go ahead and click on our graphics workspace, we will find that there's an Essential Graphics tab over here, and we'll see a whole bunch of stuff. Yours might look slightly different than mine. I think I have a few templates that I've created that you probably don't have access to. Well, you certainly don't unless I gave them to you. Over here you see a bunch of templates that are already created, which are easily you can easily add to your video project and then customize to your video. You'll also see right next to templates Adobe Stock, which has a whole lot of really interesting graphic overlays and templates. 67 pages of them here. We can filter them by free ones as well and jump through pages to see what's kind of going on here. With both the templates and the Adobe Stock templates, if we click on any of these and then we kind of hover left to right, we're scrubbing through the video so we can see what's happening there. So then you can more accurately find out if this is going to work for your particular project. So tons of stuff that exists here. All of these things are customizable. Some are overlays. I would assume almost all of these are overlays. But if you look through these things, chances are you've seen a few of these before. And that's because they are free and a lot of people use Adobe Premiere. So if you do use these things, I highly recommend you customize them so that they're a little bit different at least, and you don't look like your videos are all coming from the same place as other people. Under my templates here, these are like we can scale up our previews. And these work the same way. We can kind of scrub through and see what's going to happen here. This one dissolves in and then I would assume dissolves out. Yeah, sure does. And on mine here, you see a few of these like error messages or warnings. And that's just saying that I don't have the font that was used to create these things. So if I click Sync Missing Fonts, right click and go there, I'll see what font they intended to be used for this template, and I don't have it on my computer, so it can't resolve that. It's just going to throw whatever typeface it once on there, and it might not work out so well for me. So if I scroll down a little bit, I can see I've created this lower third template for a different project. So the thing that's really cool about Essential Graphics is if you're at all familiar with Adobe After Effects, you can create really unique and interesting animations inside After Effects. After Effects is like the program for creating animated text effects, but then you can throw that into an effect inside After Effects called Essential Graphics. You can move all of your properties over into that Essential Graphics tab, and then export a motion graphics template that you can then bring into Premiere, and then you can customize the text out. So you don't have to do that in the past. If you wanted to create unique text effects in After Effects, you would have to export each and every one of those, or at least do a linked composition inside Premiere for every single one that you needed. So if it's a lower third, you might have several of those for your project. And you'd have to customize each one inside After Effects. Now you can just work with the Essential Graphics tab, make the animation, import the template into Premiere, and then you can change that stuff out on the fly. Think about how frustrating it would be if someone's name was spelled incorrectly and you had to jump out into a different program, fix the misspelling, export it, re-enter it into your Adobe Premiere Pro project file, and then export it from there. We can save ourselves a ton of steps this way. So if I grab this was intended for some 4K footage. I click, drag, and drop it. I'm initially not going to see it because we're in 720p. So I'd need to scale this stuff down. If we click, drag, and drop any of these Essential Graphics templates, we can adjust those things just like we would a conventional video clip. So if I click on that and head on over to my effect controls, just like we did with the previous lesson, I can scale that down until it fits on my screen properly. I can also adjust the position if, say, I needed these things to be in the title safe area. So we did do the title safe, action safe earlier, but just in case you don't remember, we can add a button here for title safe and action safe and toggle that on, and I can see my text is a little bit outside of the title safe area. So I might want to adjust that. And all of a sudden my lower third is working for me. Maybe it's a little too big or something, but we're going to say that that's okay. From here, because it's a template in here, if I just click that and go to edit under Essential Graphics, I can now change out the person's name. So I don't know what this person's name is. I'll just put my own name. Okay, and now it's instantly changed, and I can change out the title for that person. And we still have that same animation, so it's going to fly in a bar that reaches a certain length, and then the text animates in and then eventually animates out. I also have some customized items for underline size. Since our underline is now much too long, I can shrink that down, and I can adjust the position as well. So you'll find this for virtually every template that you add, that you can adjust certain aspects that the creators intended you to be able to adjust. And that's always going to be the text itself, but usually also some animation properties. So if we look at maybe another basic Essential Graphics template, let's just grab this angled text here and drag and drop that. We'll see a couple of things here. If we click on it and go on over to the Edit tab under Essential Graphics, we'll see all of the animation properties here. You can change the title, right? So let's just change that real quick. Oops. we go. So we just changed that to the title. And then if maybe we didn't like a certain aspect of this animation, like the digital glitch as the title comes in here, we can just shy that out by clicking the eye icon next to mosaic, because mosaic is the effect that is doing that. So we liked how it flew in, and we like the glow, and we like the 3D on it. So we'll just let that go that way. Now, if we are working from scratch, I'd like to work from scratch to show you what all of this stuff does, though. Okay, so let's just go ahead and delete that real quick, and let's make our own title in Premiere. It's nice and easy for us to do. If we grab this type tool, that's the only tool we haven't covered from the toolbar, we can type out, once again, the title. And maybe that looks pretty good. Hey, it does. It doesn't look too bad, right? It's a little bit hard for us to see with the background being so busy and stuff. And maybe it's too big, maybe it's too small. Maybe we want to adjust all certain aspects of this stuff. So right away, as soon as I create the text under Essential Graphics, we see there are layers here. And the title is the only layer that we have available to us, because that's all we've created is just the text here. But we can add extra things. So right underneath here, you see there's a new item button, just like there is in your program monitor. But in this case, it is a new layer button, so we can create new layers here. And you can add additional text. You can add vertical text, which, by the way, is another tool. Underneath the type tool, you have the vertical type tool. You can also add rectangles, ellipses, and from file. So if you select from file, you can bring in whatever kind of graphic you would like. So if you have something that is specific for, say, your logo, you can bring that in next to your title. If we grab a rectangle really quickly, that will make a rectangle for us, and we can grab our regular selection tool up here and adjust this thing. We can adjust it just like we would any graphic in the program. We can grab the handles here and stretch that thing out. We can also move that anchor point if we happen to want to rotate things. I don't, and I'm probably going to get rid of this rectangle in general. So I can rename this maybe to rectangle. So as I add multiple layers, I will be able to tell what's going on there. All I have to do is click it and then click the text to be able to rename my layer. And if you've ever worked in Photoshop before, or even in After Effects, layers are pretty self-explanatory. The layer that is the uppermost layer will be the most visible to us, and everything underneath it will be covered up by that initial layer. So right now we have the rectangle layer that's above the title layer, so the rectangle is covering up the title. If we want to move that, we can just click, drag, and drop it, and there it is above the rectangle. Now, directly underneath here, we can also create groups in here as well. If you really get a whole lot of layers here and you want to stay organized, you can create a brand new group, rename that group, maybe assets. Look at that. Now we could have assets in one group, and then maybe transformable assets in a separate group. However you want to work it is probably fine. So directly underneath our layer panel in here is this pin to video frame. Now what this is intended to do is to pin your video. Like if you're making this into a template, and it might go out to, right now we're in 720p, and you saw when I brought in my lower third earlier, my lower third template, I had to shrink that down because it was intended for 4K footage. Now if I had done something like this and pinned it to all corners or all sides of my video frame, then if I drag and drop this template onto a 1080p video, it's always going to occupy this the same amount of the frame. So it's all relative to the resolution of your project. So if I make this in 720, and I'll go ahead and do this real quick. Let's turn this into a graphics template. So we have this the title. It doesn't really do anything, but let's say we really like the gray rectangle background and the typeface and stuff like that. We're going to right-click the graphic clip in our timeline, and then we are going to head on over to export as motion graphics template, and I will just call this the title, and I'm going to save this under my templates folder. You can save this in a bunch of places. You can save it on your local drive. That way you have easy access to it. You can maybe email it to somebody if you'd like. You can also save this on the cloud so you can share it a little bit easier, and you can maybe jump to a different computer that has your Adobe Premiere username, password, and then you can download it that way to different projects. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and press OK here. And now it's saved in my template. So if I head on over to my templates and I search for the title, the same thing that I've named it, press enter, and there it is. Now it should look fine because it already did in my 720p project. But if I go ahead and create a brand new sequence, we're going to create a new sequence here. I'm going to make sure that that's a 1080p project. Okay, so now if I look for that same version of the title, it still occupies the same area of my my video screen, right? It is a little bit off center. I wouldn't use this honestly, but it's going to work relatively the same way regardless of the size of your video. So if you want some versatility to your template that you're creating there, then that's the way to do it. So I'm going to head back on over, well, since we turned this into its own thing. So back in the Essential Graphics area, so if I click on the text here, I have a bunch of options. If I click on the rectangle, I have a few options as well. Let's go with the rectangle. Since it's less options, we can work through this a little bit quicker. So way down at the bottom here, if I wanted to change the color of my rectangle, I can also add a stroke and a shadow. If I want to, I can click the fill here. So changing the fill, the inner area of our rectangle, to black. I can turn it black that way. I can turn it any color that I'd like. How about burgundy? Okay, now if I'd like to add a stroke, we can add an outline to our graphic, and this is an inner stroke, not an outer stroke, so it's going to like kind of choke down whatever graphic you have here. We can change the color of that stroke as well. So if I wanted, maybe let's do like a dark green. Okay, so add a stroke that way very easily. We can also add a shadow. You can do any color that you'd like with a shadow, but I would recommend a gray color since that's usually how we see our shadows. You can from here you can adjust the angle of the shadow to maybe match the video that you have here. You can adjust the opacity of the shadow. You can adjust the spread of the shadow. You can adjust basically anything that you could ever want with the shadow. How big the shadow is, how far away it is from your shape, and how feathered the edges are, all adjustable right here under the shadow properties. I'm going to turn the shadow off. I might keep the stroke on. I think that looks all right. moving upward from appearance here, you can see align and transform, and we can just click and drag and move the position. You can see the position numbers changing when I do that. You can also grab the anchor point and move that. I think I mentioned that already though. You can also use these align and transform buttons, which are very helpful and interesting. So if we want our rectangle here to be aligned at the vertical and horizontal centers, I can click on these two buttons here. So align at the vertical center, align at the horizontal center. And this is really important. I generally see a whole lot of people try to eyeball a center point, and it might look okay on a small screen, but once you blow it up, you can certainly see the issues there. You can also align things to the top of the screen, to the bottom of the screen, to the center of the screen here, and you can do the same for left, right, and center for alignment. Okay, now if I, there's also opacity down here as well, and rotation if you'd like to rotate. Hey, there's rotation for us. And if you'd like to turn down the opacity of this layer, you can do that as well. And maybe I will turn down the opacity just a hair to around 90%. Okay, now I'm going to hop on over to my title. And since it is text, we have a few other options here. I can, once again, make sure that my title occupies the a relative area of the frame regardless of my sequence size, and then I can match my rectangle by aligning my text at both center points. Okay, same things go for the text. We can use all of those same alignment principles, but there are all of these things that exist for text specifically. So if you're familiar at all with the text properties in Photoshop, this should not look too different for you. Also, the text properties in After Effects should look very similar as well. So if we wanted to center our text within the text box, we can do that. Right now, I think that it is absolutely centered since we made our text box the size of our text specifically. But if the idea is for us to change out the title with whatever text that we want in the next project that we have, maybe it would be ideal to center align our text here so it's centered in the actual text box, and then realign using the align and transform buttons above. Okay, we can adjust the size of our text using this slider here. You can also just type in a number for this. If maybe you want the text to be a little bit smaller, we can switch that over to 100%. But do keep in mind, as you adjust these things, you might have to go back and adjust the alignment. Okay, we can also adjust the leading and kerning and spacing of our text, especially if we have multiple lines of text. In this case, we don't, but all of these things are definitely adjustable for us. We can add a faux bold. We can add a faux italic. We can add a faux italic. We can add all caps if we weren't already working in all caps. We can add small caps. We can add superscript or subscript, which would give us, like the squared, like if we wanted the title squared, we could certainly pull that off. There we go, the title squared, or cubed, or whatever you'd like there. It is maybe a little bit more of a niche thing, but it certainly is possible inside Essential Graphics. Okay, we can also underline our text if that's something that we'd like. All we have to do is highlight the text, press the underline button, and now our text is underlined. You might not be able to see that just yet. There it is. And that doesn't look too bad here. Just to make our text look our rectangle look a little bit more like our text, I'm going to jump back there. I'm going to change out that stroke to be white. All right, now that matches a little bit nicer. Okay, if I want to change the typeface, that's probably the thing you want to do most of all. If we highlight the text once again, and that is the very first option we have for the text area of our Essential Graphics tab. So if I wanted to change that out to be something like that, I could. I do like the typeface that I have there. If there are options for your typeface, whether it's thin or bold or black, or there's various options for different typefaces. Those are available through this drop-down right here. Now, one last thing that I'd like to show you inside the Essential Graphics tab, if we jump outside of the text layer, if we look at the entirety of our graphic here, if we just click that in our timeline, you'll see this responsive design time. And here we have the option for us to roll credits. So if we want our credits to start off screen and roll through, we can make that happen. So we can do end credits this way. A very common thing in end credits is rolling credits, especially if you have a lot of people working on a project. So under roll here, you see that you can start off screen and end off screen. Chances are you do want to do that, but maybe you want the title to start on screen, but then end off screen. So it's going to start, it's just going to pop in, and then it's going to start rolling. So that might be a common thing that you want to do as well. Outside of the Essential Graphics, there's not much to tell you, but it is important to know that this reacts exactly the same as any kind of video in terms of adding effects or transitions. So instead of this just like popping in here, if we wanted this to dissolve in, I'm just going to press Control D for that quick transition. So now it dissolves in and takes off. And if I want this to roll out slower, that is one way that it is a little bit different than a regular video. So as we stretch this thing out, it is going to affect how the text animates versus, instead of using something like the rate stretch tool. So it kind of works like the rate stretch tool, just by grabbing the handles and pulling it outward. Unlike the rate stretch tool, it will not cause choppy playback. Maybe one more thing to let you know about is that if you do create templates outside of Premiere, or you get them from, say, a friend, you might need to add those templates into your templates folder here, or into Premiere in general. So how we do that is really, really easy. You click this little button down here in the bottom right-hand corner. When it says, if you hover over it, it says Install Motion Graphics Template. So if you click that, you navigate to the, it is a .mogrt file that you've created out of, say, After Effects, and then that will add it to your templates folder. Now, if you have this stuff, if you're creating it inside Premiere, once again, if we wanted to do something like that, let me just pull Control Z until I get my title back here. It's as simple as right-clicking and then going to Export Motion Graphics Template. Now, if you want to share those things, again, with somebody else, local drive, and then email that as an attachment to someone, or you can save it in your local templates folder, and it will be available to you anytime you open up Adobe Premiere. Okay. So at this point, you should be able to cut your footage together, whether that's using the source monitor and timeline or just the timeline. You should be able to add effects and add transitions. You should also be able to add titles to your project. So at this point, you might want to export your video file. Now, exporting your video file is fairly simple, just like everything in Premiere. You can go and do this a couple of different ways. You can go to File, Export Media. You can use a shortcut for that, Control M, so exporting media, right? And then you'll get this export settings window where you can tell the program what kind of format you'd like to export your video in. If you're doing something like a YouTube video, maybe H.264 makes sense. If you're doing a very long video and you don't want it to take up a bunch of space on your computer, an H.264 might make sense as well. It is a fairly highly compressed video file, but you can also adjust some settings with it to make it a better quality video. So depending on what your client might ask for in terms of a video file format, you have all of those options here. And H.264 does make sense for a whole lot of applications if you're going out to, say, like YouTube, or maybe you have a very long video that you don't want it to take up a massive amount of space. H.264 might make sense there. But it is a pretty highly compressed codec. So if you're working with that red R3D footage and you don't want to lose any of that quality, you might pick something a little bit more high quality, but it's always a balancing act. If you do pick something with more quality to it, it will take up more space on your hard drive, and it will be harder to send to someone if that's the case. Okay, they do have a ton of options in terms of codecs in Adobe Premiere. Something that is unique about Premiere on a Windows machine is that it can actually export ProRes files, which is a little bit different for Windows. Like if you are on a Mac machine, virtually every NLE will let you export ProRes, which is a standard for a whole lot of platforms. If we wanted to do something like that, we would have to select QuickTime from format, and that would give us the option for several codecs in here, including Apple ProRes, and there's various versions of ProRes, which it would kind of depend on, again, what your client would want. Okay, when we are exporting our stuff too, before we get too deep into the export settings over here, we want to make sure that we are exporting what we want to export. So we see that this is a representation of our timeline, and we can scrub through here. We can also set, we can also make sure that we're exporting either the entire sequence, a sequence in to out. So if you set in and out points on your timeline before you jump in here, your work area, or a custom area. So we can actually say, well, you know what? I don't want all of my video. I just want the part with the title. Okay. So even if you forgot to set in and out points, you can do it right in here. Back over to the right side of things, we can adjust this once again. I'm just going to put this as Apple ProRes 422 HQ, a pretty high quality format. Where it says output name here, if we click that text, we have the option to name our file a custom name and tell the program where the file should be saved. In this case, it's going to be saved on the desktop and be called test.mov. We'd also add some comments to our video, which would appear as metadata in our final export. There is a check mark up here that says match sequence settings. If we click that really quickly, it's going to take the guesswork out of your export. So no longer will you have an Apple ProRes version. It's going to export something very similar to your original file, your original footage. I'm going to turn that off so I can customize how my video will come out here. And there's a bunch of stuff that is a little bit hard for me to see right now because my window is resized. So if I resize this window, I can see, hey, there's a bunch of extra data that I can adjust here. So the video codec is Apple ProRes 422 HQ. Yep. The video settings, it kind of depends on which codec you have selected here, what options you have available to you. But if I turn that toggle off, I can actually adjust my final resolution. So if I wanted to gang these things together and make my resolution higher, maybe I go to 1920. Okay, now it's going to stretch out my 720p footage into a 1920 by 1080 final export. I wouldn't recommend scaling up so much, but scaling down might make sense to you, especially if you have like 8K footage and you need to just export a 1080p so maybe a client can see what you've been working on. You can also adjust things like frame rate, field order in case you have some footage that you want to not have a progressive scan image. I don't see a real application to this other than maybe it has like an issue that doesn't match what your original footage was shot in. But most cameras shoot a progressive scan now. You can also adjust your aspect ratio or your pixel aspect ratio if you happen to have something, again, like anamorphic footage, which is very, very rare. Okay, render at maximum depth. So this is your color depth here. So you can potentially export your video file as like 16-bit color versus 8-bit color, and it really depends again on your application. The higher bit depth you have, the more likely it is to be a very large file. So if you want to keep this down low, especially if like the original footage was shot at 8-bit color, which a whole lot of cameras do, you might want to do that. If you do some serious color grading stuff, even with the original footage being 8-bit, you might want to do 16-bit color. That way you can see everything that all the work that you've done without any kind of issues with colors being changed somewhat. Okay, you have color space here too, and you have options with ProRes for Rec 709, Rec 2100, and Rec 2100 PQ. You would need to take a look at some color charts to see what that does, but generally Rec 709 is the display that most people have. So you kind of have to know what you're exporting for, specifically what kind of monitors and stuff. Currently Rec 709 is still the standard for most people's screens, so if you want to see it for a Rec 709 screen, you might export it that way, but maybe you're also going out for maybe a theater projector that does do something that is beyond Rec 709, and you want to conform it specifically for that. That is an option for you there. Advanced settings here, you can optimize your stills. It's an interesting thing. You might use it and you might not. So if the idea is your ProRes file might be edited later, then maybe you wouldn't want to check on optimize stills. So the idea with it is that if you had a still image in your video, rather than export each frame for every frame in terms of time, it would just take one of those frames and say this frame should last this long in the video. So I don't see any issues with it in terms of playback, right? Like if this is your final video output and someone's going to watch it, that could potentially save some data to, like not have 150 frames that are the same exact thing. Instead, you have one that lasts a certain period of time. But I think it's not super versatile in terms of bringing that into different programs. Like, will it be able to read that that still is supposed to last this long? It should be able to, but just to keep everything really versatile, I would not select that on. With a lot of the video codecs, you have options for, let's just jump back to H.264 so we can see that real quick. So back to H.264, you might have some different options here. You have the same things with changing the resolution or the pixel aspect ratio, but you'll also notice that there are options for bitrate settings. So you can turn up or down the bitrate depending on how large you want the file to be. But I think the standard here, it pops up as variable bitrate 1 pass. So what this means is that your bitrate can change throughout the video depending on how complex the image is. And then you have a target bitrate. You say it should be around 10 megabytes per second, but the maximum bitrate that you'll allow is up to 12. So if things get really complicated, it won't pass the 12 megabytes per second threshold. Why it is set for variable bitrate 1 pass versus variable bitrate 2 pass is mostly due to exporting quickly. So with 2 passes, it will analyze your video twice over, export it twice, and then use the most efficient use of these target bit rates. So if you use a variable bitrate 1 pass, you might actually find that if you went from something very quiet in terms of its visual complexity, so maybe it's the camera is still on a tripod pointed at something that isn't really moving very much, so almost a still image, and then the very next frame it gets really complicated, a handheld camera, so all these pixels are moving all at once, and then we're outdoors with lots of leaves that are moving in opposite ways and stuff, lots of motion blur. That's a lot of pixels moving very quickly. You might have noticed it in some videos that you've even seen with a variable bitrate where you'll see major artifacting for just a couple of seconds and then it switches back and looks okay. And that's probably that variable bitrate 1 pass versus 2 passes. So if you want your videos to look good and you are using the H.264 codec, I would highly recommend the 2 pass version. You can also use a constant bitrate which will remove the maximum bitrate threshold, and then you just set your bitrate for what you want it to be. It really depends on how big you want your file size to be, and also how long your video is, what kind of numbers you put here. But if you find, just really generally, you find that your video doesn't look great with your export, you can always turn up that target bitrate and turn up the maximum bitrate, and you'll notice that your video quality should get a little bit better. So that's video for you, but there are all these other tabs under here too. You're going to see effects. If you wanted to add a LUT, a lookup table, or a Lumetri look to your video, or any of these other effects, you can add a time code overlay in your export here. There's all sorts of things to kind of tweak your audio or video or look in the export versus the actual edit and stuff. All you have to do is check mark that stuff on and then adjust those properties. Under audio, you have options depending on what your video codec is. You can have MP3 or AAC audio codec here, and you can adjust the audio quality and bitrate. Now, here's a big thing that I see very often with H.264, and that is the audio bitrate being way down here at like 128 kilobits per second. If you've ever listened to a very bad MP3, it might be 128 kilobits per second MP3. It doesn't take up too much space to go bump that up to 320 kilobits per second, and that's going to help you out in terms of your audio quality. The sample rate should always be 48,000 hertz for video, but potentially I can't imagine a reason why you would export a video file that is strictly audio, but for CDs and stuff, you can have 44.1 kilohertz. Stereo versus mono versus 5.1. Again, this is going to really matter for your what you're working with in the actual program. In our case, we have no audio whatsoever, so none of this stuff is actually going to matter in our export, but it is important to kind of know. So if you are working in 5.1 surround sound, you certainly want to select that for your export. If you're working in mono, you want to select that for your export. So as soon as you click 5.1 surround sound, it'll probably give you some kind of hassle. You have to have certain codecs installed on your computer to export 5.1, since Dolby is Dolby is not the nicest company in the world. Okay, you have the multiplexer here, where you say this is our exported file type as an MP4. We could change that to a 3GPP if you'd like, and if you want some kind of stream compatibility for handheld devices, those are optional here. You can add a caption file if you'd like. You can always add this after the fact as well. And it looks like that is actually not an option for H.264, which makes a lot of sense since it's a very small file size. You can also go under the Publish tab here and publish your video directly to the Adobe Creative Cloud, your Adobe Creative Cloud account. You can also publish your stuff to Adobe Stock, Behance, which is your it's like an online portfolio that you can have. You can publish your stuff to Facebook directly. You can FTP it to your website. There's also Twitter and YouTube and Vimeo here. And all you have to do to set this stuff up is log in with your username and password for any of these accounts, and it will upload directly for you as the stuff exports. So that's maybe a little bit more convenient for you. I personally would just export it to your local drive, to your hard drive or something. That way you have an opportunity to look at it there and then look at it after it uploads to, say, YouTube. And it's much easier for me to troubleshoot my issues if I kind of work along with them. So if I export this to my local drive first and then look at it and then upload it to YouTube afterwards, and then there's something wrong with it, I know right off the bat something happened in my YouTube upload and not in my exported video file. Okay, there's still a couple more things to look at. Use maximum render quality. So if you hover over that, it says gives better quality scaling but increases the encode time. So if you are scaling things up, if this was a 720p project, right now my output is 720p, we probably don't need that. But if we were scaling this up to 1920 by 1080, or even scaling it down to maybe standard definition, this would be pretty important to select. Use previews, which is right next to it here. If you happen to have some stuff that was red on your timeline, you rendered in to out and stuff. So say like you have some title effects and stuff, and you needed to render that to see it. You can use the use previews selection here to make your render time just a little bit quicker on export because you've already done it inside the program. Import into project would just very self-explanatory. As this thing gets exported, do you want the final export to be imported directly back into your project? You can always do that outside of the export window here. You can export it and then import it like you would any other footage. You can, if you are going to work with time code either embedded, or you want to use this maybe in an edit later, you can set the start time code to be something other than 0. If you don't have this selected on, it will start at 0 seconds, 0 frames regardless. If it's supposed to be part of a larger video and stuff, then maybe you set your start time code to be something specific. You can render alpha channel only, and if you select that on, you'll see exactly what that's going to do. A big white video. It could come in handy if you're doing something like graphics and you just want to export the graphic and you don't want the background or something like that. You can use that render alpha channel only. Now, time interpolation is exactly like what we did with slowing down and speeding up our video. So time interpolation here is very similar to what we did when we were speeding up or slowing down our video. The idea here, though, is that if you have frame rates that aren't the frame rate that you are exporting at. So right now we are exporting 23.976 frames per second, but we shot at 30 frames per second. It's going to do some kind of interpolation of that frame rate. It's going to downsample our frame rate from 30 frames per second to 24. So how do you want to do that? Depends on what you select here. So same deal as before, optical flow, especially if you're going upward in frames. So if we shot at 24 frames per second, but we're actually exporting at 60, then all of a sudden really it would be important that you have optical flow selected on. Now, if you're going the opposite direction, it's probably not going to matter too much. Frame sampling is going to be a little bit quicker. It's just going to cut some frames out of there and shouldn't have many issues going the opposite way. So in our case, we're probably fine going from 30 frames per second to 24. Okay, there is still more in this window here. Okay, so over here on source scaling, you see scale to fit, scale to fill, or stretch to fill. These would be intended for if your export is going to be larger than the original footage was. So if we jumped this up to 1920 by 1080, but let's do this other version real quick for you. So I'm going to jump back over to the video tab, and my export size, we're just going to toggle that off real quick. We're not going to do 1920 by 1080, but we'll do 1920 by, we're going to just ungang this real quick, 720. All right, so here we'll be able to tell the difference between these things. So scale to fit is going to scale up your image to fit the frame. And we have these black bars here because our width is much larger than our height. Okay, scale to fill will scale up our image to fill out the entire frame. So it's a uniform scale upward. Okay, so you'll get some cropped tops and bottoms in this case. So down here, there's just a little bit more to talk about. There is queue and export. So if we wanted to actually export our video, all we would have to do is press the export button and the program would export our video. And you wouldn't really be able to do anything else until your video actually exports or you cancel that export. But the queue button here, if we click that really quickly, it is going to load up a new program or a separate program called Adobe Media Encoder, which basically lets you render videos in the background while you can continue to work with Adobe Premiere or whatever program you're working with. So it's going to load up as its own file over here. There it is. And then it's got our H.264 settings and it's going to come out here. And all we have to do to get this export going is hit the play button. I can also just click this export button here though, and our export will start going. If we have a very short video, this is a totally fine way to work. Either way you go, either using the media encoder or just Adobe Premiere, you should be set. All right, so that's it. So now we know about making and adjusting text inside Adobe Premiere, working with the Essential Graphics panel, and exporting our videos in both H.264 and ProRes, and just adjusting the settings generally.